Now, of course, one of the most obvious groups that comes up in terms of discrimination in the United States during the 19th century are, of course, African slaves. Now, slavery has dominated U.S. national policy through the 19th century, and it very much underlines the fragility of the Union and this attachment of sectional differences. The Mexican American War, in terms of gaining access to Texas and expansion of territory. The Dred Scott decision, which very much underlined the fact that blacks, no matter if they lived in Northern Territory, Southern Territory, no matter where slavery is legal or illegal, are not considered citizens of the United States. The Kansas Nebraska Act, the Compromise of 1850, the Missouri Compromise, all these things which are basically trying to underlie or create some sort of stability between the abolitionists and between the South, who very much want slavery to continue. And so often, part of the reason why we have so many compromises is because one compromise cannot fix the problem. They keep trying to throw other compromises, other fixes, and yet eventually this is just going to have to come to a head. Now, the Civil War is the bloodiest American military conflict in history up to the modern day. The casualties that come from the Iraq War, Afghanistan, the First Gulf War, Vietnam, Korea, World War II, World War I, the Spanish American War, if you added them all up, you might get close to the casualties of the Civil War, but not quite. This war devastated the country. And it's also very much a tie of how fragile all these states, these new states are. We tend to think of the United States as existing in perpetuity. It's been here for as long as we have. It has a long history of 200 years. And yet, from 1861 to 1865, it broke up. It split. Now, it eventually did end up mending itself, but it's definitely an indication that these ideas of government, these ideas of governance that we consider to be so permanent, so long lasting, aren't necessarily always so. It actually takes a great deal of time to cultivate this loyalty and this acceptance. Now, the deck is pretty much stacked against the South for the Civil War. They do have great generals. They have great men who can become great soldiers because shooting, riding, that's very much second nature to them. But they could never deliver the military death blow to the Union. And when the Union Army, after 2, 3 years of sort of struggling to actually get their act together, are finally able to get the South in a stranglehold, it's going to spell the end for the South. Now, it's funny that the original Northern plan for victory in the Civil War was called the Anaconda Plan, again, a reference to the anaconda snake. And basically, the plan was going to take a long time to actually try to implement because it was focusing on Southern weaknesses and Northern strengths. The fact that because the North has industry, because they have all these resources that the South does not have, that they should be able to win the war. What they have to do is cut off the South's access to any sort of supplies. So this means the very few factories, munitions, arms, anything like that in the South are going to have to be destroyed. Major ports like Vicksburg in the Mississippi, New Orleans, Jacksonville, Charleston, Savannah, all these ports are going to have to be cut off. So they cannot trade with Latin America or Europe. And then you're going to have to destroy the railroad system in the South. Louisiana, Charleston again, all these major centers, so the South is basically a sitting duck. Now, this was initially rejected at the very beginning of the phase of the war because it was going to take so much time. And both sides were really looking for an easy victory. But after 1863, after both sides have been trying for these major military victories, it's pretty much going to be accepted by the North that, all right, the Anaconda Plan is what we're going to have to use. We're going to eventually have to back the South into a corner. And the South very much realizes as their ports are cut off, as the Union um, gains more access to key areas in the South, as European support for the Confederacy does not materialize, they too begin to realize this danger that they are in. Now, rebuilding of the nation is very much going to be fraught with tension, and this is termed as Reconstruction. And it's not just Reconstruction of the South, basically the rebuilding of the infrastructure, but we're also talking about political ties, national relations, national unity, and also racial society, and this is going to be the loaded question. Now, immediately after the Civil War, the South is under military occupation, so the Union Army does not totally disband. And this military occupation and very strong federal oversight is necessary for Reconstruction to continue. And it's very useful for the freed slaves because they're not going to necessarily be assisted by the South. The South is very, very bitter, not just of the fact that they have lost the war, they are economically destitute, that their population has been damaged so badly, but this idea of racial intermixing, not necessarily in terms of biological mixing, but simply mixing as equals in society, is something they have always tried to suppress. And now it's actually happening right before their eyes. So this federal oversight takes the form of generally the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau is basically a massive organization. They have offices all over the South, and they are specifically there to help freedmen try and either move, to find lost families, to find jobs, to secure voting rights, and to have an education. All these things that would not necessarily be open to them if the South were allowed to totally rebuild on their own. They're also going to allow them to hold office, and so the 1960s through the 1860s through the early 1870s, you're going to see first blacks holding office, not just regional, not just in your local government, your state government, but also in Congress. Now, Reconstruction is going to end in 1977, and not because the South has been completely Reconstruction, everything is going to be fine. It was actually ended because of the 1876 presidential election. So from 1861 through 1876, we've been having a run of Republican candidates. Now, the 1876 election is very, very, very close to call. Basically, in terms of Gore and Bush, close to call. And so there's a backroom deal with a lot of the Democrats and the Republicans. And the Democrats say, okay, look, we will get our representatives to sway the votes towards your candidate. But when Hayes takes office, he has to end the military occupation in Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. And we want you to start easing up on the Freedmen's Bureau, on all this oversight. And the Republicans, because they do want to stay in power, they want to retain the White House, they say, okay, fine, we'll do it. And so when Hayes removes federal troops, opportunity is going to dry up for the freedmen. Sharecropping or remaining on the plantations is going to become the only economic possibility for many former slaves, and very little ability for them to own land. This is also going to be when segregation is really going to be taking its stronghold.